everybody. I just keep filming these in case I want to use the footage. I'm kind of trying to work a little bit with gouache. And gouache is, I'm not a professional at gouache, so I don't, what I'm going to say is just, take it with a grain of salt. But my understanding of gouache is that gouache is similar to watercolor in that it is activated by water. And it uses gum arabic as the binder, just as watercolor does. The difference is that the pigment is ground much less finely. So watercolor pigment is ground much finer, and this causes the movement that you get, and it causes the transparency that you get. Gouache is the same pigment and same binder, but it is ground much larger granules, and so it is much more opaque, so that you can cover things up, and it is, even if you thin it down to watercolor transparency, it still doesn't, in my experience, it doesn't act exactly like watercolor, and that is because the pigment is ground larger. You can wash it down to something very thin, but it's not quite the same as watercolor. So I've heard people say, and this is my agreement would be, is if you take acrylic paints, which are very opaque and can be layered, from dark to light. Watercolor, you have to go from light to dark, and if you lose your lights, you're out of luck. I mean, there's some tricks and stuff, but for the most part, you're out of luck. Whereas gouache and acrylics and oils, things of that nature that are opaque, you can build the darks and then layer lights on top of it. That's something you can't do, and that's something that really appeals to me. You can also layer thicker paint, although you have to be careful with gouache because it can crack. But you can layer thicker and get more textures and things like that, such as acrylic. Acrylic, however, once it dries, is not reactivated, and so you can layer on top of it and it will never touch the layer that is below it, but it also dries glossy. Now again, you can use some tricks like matte mediums and things like that to cause it to be matte, but it is a plastic basically, and it does dry glossy in its natural state. Gouache dries very matte, as you'll see. Now there are some definite exceptions, and I noticed that in the painting I'm going to show you in a minute. There are some exceptions. I've seen a little bit of gloss on some of these, and but for the most part it dries very flat, and it is water soluble. So that means I can go in, and I will do this right here. This has been dried for a few days, and I can go in and I can reactivate that color because it never fully cures. And so this can be fantastic, but it also can be tricky because if you're doing layering like you want to do, you have to use less and less water the higher up the layers you go, so that you don't reactivate the surface below it. So in essence, it is that watercolor and acrylic had a baby, and it's gouache. That's kind of the general idea here. So for me, I love watercolor. I use watercolor, but I crave texture. I crave being able to even put things on, like with a palette knife. And I crave a little bit ability to go from dark to lights and things of that nature. And so I do want to learn to work with watercolor. Now I have worked with watercolor for a while, or I'm sorry, with gouache, and I've used it, but I've used it sort of as if it was watercolor that's more opaque. I haven't really used it as gouache, and so that's something that I want to change, but it's, it's a learning curve because it's a different medium. Even though it's water soluble, it's a different medium. So I took I watched a bunch of videos, as I am wont to do, and one of the channels, and I'll put a link to that in the description box below, one of the channels that I really enjoyed watching was somebody who also went from watercolor to gouache, so same challenges. So she gave, in her Patreon, if you support her as a Patreon, you can get a bunch of pictures, photographs that she took in Scotland. Her name is Sarah Burns. And so I thought, I'm going to try to use this paint. I love the oranges and the reds. I don't know what's going to be showing, to be honest, because this is, you know, camera to a screen. But it's got beautiful yellows and golds and oranges in the picture. That's what really intrigued me about this. So, so I tried to do this in gouache. Now, there were some things that were successful. I do really like how the further mountains went. You know, I was trying to figure out the medium, and this became a really big mess, but I learned a lot. I learned, you know, that I should have just done more single sweeping motions. I shouldn't, this is a sketchbook. I did not intend this to be a finished picture. It is a study so that you can figure out some things before you actually do a full painting oftentimes. So a lot of times, or, you know, obviously people use sketch for a variety of different things, but a lot of times, and my intention with starting this gouache sketchbook was to use this as a study to kind of figure things out, get some basic shapes, basic colors, and then either redo it again, you know, for practice in here, or make another painting of it. So this wasn't for me intended to be a finished painting, but to learn some things, and I did learn some things. But overall, it was a little disappointing. And but then there were some things I was excited about. One of the things that I think I've learned, and the purpose of this particular video, is that I think what I really want is a mix of both of watercolor and gouache. Like, I do think that what I'm looking for is a little bit of both. So this time around, I'm going to take the same study, but I'm going to do some things in watercolor and some things in gouache, and I think that's, you know, I think that's what I'm looking for gouache to be, where I'd like to see almost things sort of muted out in the watercolor, and then some bold just pieces that are the gouache, and kind of just see how that turns out. This is literally just playing with paint and trying to figure out how gouache can do what I want it to do. I apologize for my hands. I was painting my niece's house. She got a new house, and we were painting today, and I thought, well, my hands are already a mess, so I'm just going to paint a painting. So anyways, I have an idea in my head where I think that I think the best of both worlds is what I'm shooting for. So we'll see. I'm just going to play. I'm going to put this to some music, play around, and just see what happens after this. going to leave this go. So I'm not sure that I'm 100% satisfied with this, but there's more about this that I like than about this. Let me move this out of the way. I'm also testing paints, so this was the original all gouache, and I really love the sky here. I even really love the clouds here. I love using the watercolor for the further mountains, and then into the more solid gouache here, where if you look at the image, I don't know really how much you're going to be able to see, but if you look at the image, there's this impact of dark, deep color, and everything else is actually quite a bit lighter. And so now I could go in here and obviously do some more details, but the point of this isn't to actually do a lot of details. In fact, the exact opposite of the point is, you know, not doing a lot of details. But for example, I think in the future I would not have I would not have done these, I think, with the gouache. You get a much prettier, thinner lines with the watercolor, and so I would have done in the future these types of lines where I can control the thinness and the thickness a little bit better, I think, with watercolor than with gouache. That is definitely something that I would pay attention to in the future. And you know, obviously I can go in here and still add, okay, that was a bit of a thick one, but that will dry. So I can actually just swoop that into the orange. You know, I could go in and add some more watercolor parts. But again, this is the point of this isn't to get too detailed. The point of this isn't, you know, I could even smudge a little bit of this down here at the bottom, just to pull in with the painting more. But I'm trying not to overthink it. My idea was, so what I was trying to see in here is if I couldn't keep the parts that I love about watercolor and then just have impact points and texture where I want the impact to be at. And I do think that that's the direction that I will head in. I have a long way to go in figuring out the best use of gouache. I'm still not really a big fan of it as much on the brushes, or I just haven't found a brush that I like yet. I like it a lot more with the palette knife, but maybe that's because I'm trying to get that degree of texture is sort of my goal there. So we'll see. It's a continuing evolution, right, of trying to learn a medium and see how that medium is going to fit in with what I already know and love with watercolor. So we'll see. We'll keep on playing.